Dr. Giangrande, we've been looking at the report on annual returns from 1993, and you made reference to the publication in Nature. And so for the sake of completeness, we'll just look at that now. Shomek, it's HCDO 40264_095. I think this is the publication to which you were referring, Doctor.
It is, yes.
And we can see it's entitled Mortality Before and After HIV Infection in the Complete UK Population of Haemophiliacs. And the first author is Sarah Darby, and then a number of other co-authors, including yourself. If we go to the third page, please, Shomek. And we look at the bottom half of the page. We can see, picking it up in the last paragraph on the left-hand column, we can see that this was relating to deaths, or an analysis of deaths between 1985 and 1992. And it says, during 1985 to 92, 403 deaths occurred in seropositive patients, and for 235 of these, the certified cause was AIDS. So pausing there, that would have been the cause given on the death certificate, would it?
That's right, yes.
And then the article continues, for the remaining 168 deaths in HIV seropositives, there were significant excesses for many causes indicative of AIDS, including infections, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and pneumonia, and also significant excesses for causes associated with haemophilia. Information received from the haemophilia centres indicates that many of these patients had in fact developed AIDS, indicating that in AIDS patients there is a tendency to attribute cause of death to diseases associated with haemophilia or AIDS rather than to AIDS itself. However, not all the excess mortality in patients tested seropositive for HIV appears to be due to recognised AIDS-indicated diseases, and some may be due to other conditions such as liver disease. So pausing there, Doctor, in relation to the 168 deaths in patients who were HIV positive, as I understand it, the point that is being made there, broadly put, is that AIDS may have been a contributing factor to those deaths, but was not, as a matter of fact, the certified cause of death. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And there are two things I'd say. In fact, following on from what I said earlier, I wrote to, one of my roles in this publication was to identify death certificates that we did not feel yielded the full truth, and I would write to colleagues to ask if they were able to share other information with us. The other thing I would point out is that the thing about the excess mortality, the additional point I want to make is that the 403 deaths, you may be saying that later on, we would have expected 60 on the basis of the deaths in the seronegatives, which is where the 85% excess mortality comes from.
Yes, just to complete the picture, we'll just go over the page. Well, we'll pick it up at the bottom of that page. Sorry, Shomek, before we finish. So the last 5 lines on the right-hand side, these are the first data to document that in a large and complete population, mortality among those who by chance were infected with HIV increased more than tenfold, while remaining unchanged over time in those who escaped infection, assuming that if we go to the next page and look at the bottom half of the page, please. So if we zoom in on the bottom half. Thank you. So picking it up, assuming that the death rate during 1985 to 92 among infected patients would, in the absence of HIV, have been close to that for uninfected patients, 60 deaths would have been predicted, whereas 403 deaths in fact occurred, an excess of 343. Thus, 85% of the deaths in HIV seropositive patients are likely to have been caused by HIV. This large excess, together with the temporal pattern of the increase in those who became infected, the similarity of the excess death rate associated with HIV infection, regardless of the severity of haemophilia, and the large increase in mortality from conditions not usually associated with haemophilia, demonstrate particularly clearly the enormity and specificity of the effect of HIV infection on mortality in this population. That's the figure you were just
May I
referring to.
just ask, in relation to the 60 deaths that would have been predicted, that's deaths in the absence of HIV infection.
Yes, in other words, looking at the number of people based on, that's what would have been in a population of that number, whatever the number was, we would have expected 60 deaths based on the observation of the seronegative patients.
Now, does the 60 therefore include the deaths that might have been predicted from hepatitis C?
Presumably it does, but no implication is made. It's just we're saying that's the mortality observed in the negatives, and that would include hepatitis C. So that's absolutely right. But the impact on mortality of hepatitis became much more later on. So we may be going on later to discuss subsequent publications, but at this stage, the peak of mortality due to, for instance, hepatoma had not yet been reached. So to answer your very clear question, the 60 would have nominally included hepatitis C as well.
And if the figures which you had produced yourself, that you referred us to just shortly before lunch, are right, that the figures for deaths from liver disease were equivalent to the deaths from bleeding on the brain.
Yes, and they rose even further.
The liver deaths would tend to be, I wonder, you can confirm, tend to be associated with hepatitis C infection.
That's absolutely right, Sir Brian. And I would also point out there is, and maybe Ms. Richards will refer to it, we did write a specific paper focusing on mortality due to liver disease in the haemophilic cohort, and that was published in The Lancet in 1997. So we have a paper, if you don't have it, I'm very happy to provide it, focusing specifically on that.
Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, I think we've got 4 papers, but not that one, but available today. We do have it in any event.
Okay, you have it. That's excellent.
Returning then to the Oxford database, Dr. Giangrande, and the issue of patient consent. Mm-hmm. You've said in your statement, it's paragraph 116.1, I think. So, Seamus, could we have WITN 3311003? And if we could go to page 62. Try that. If we go to the next page, sorry. You've said this, go down the page. Thank you. During my time at Oxford from 1991 to 2015, written consent was not requested from patients for their data to be entered and stored on the UK HCDO national database. After the introduction of the Data Protection Act and after some discussion within the UK HCDO, the group, that's the UK HCDO's data management group, agreed that patients would be informed that their data was being collected and stored, but consent would not be sought. A leaflet was produced for patients explaining the situation, which was distributed to haemophilia centres. And then you say, as far as you can recall, that was handed out in Oxford. And as far as you can recall, most patients in Oxford were already aware of the existence of the national database. And you say you don't recall patients expressing concern to you. So can I? Yes.
Sorry.
No, carry on.
Yes, I'm very happy to expand on this. It's certainly true, when I started in Oxford, written consent was not requested from patients. And when I left, that was the same position. And I have read the transcript of Professor Hayes' contribution. Let me say that this has been a subject of a lot of debate within UKHCDO, and my view is that we should get written consent from patients to have their data entered on the national database. And furthermore, I'm on record as saying that. It wasn't really an issue for me in my first years in Oxford. But the issue came to a head in the late 90s when several other colleagues expressed concern about sending data to Oxford. Sometimes that was the doctor themselves. Other times, as in the case of a colleague in Southampton, who is mentioned in one of the documents you've sent me, she was passing on the feelings of patients. And similarly, concern was expressed by a colleague in Sheffield. So this made collection of the annual returns quite difficult. St. Thomas's refused to send data to us from 1996 onwards. And it was particularly difficult for us to produce the 1998 annual return. And indeed, at the annual general meeting of the UKHCDO in 2000, you will see a statement to that effect. It says Paul Giangrande and Rosemary Spooner have, quote, soldiered on. So this led to a lot of discussion within UKHCDO. And I must admit, I'm going to quote some documents from among the ones you shared with me. The path I thought we were on is that we were going to be seeking consent from patients. And indeed, in my testimony to the Lindsay Tribunal in 2001, I used the future tense, saying we will be collecting information from patients. Now, what changed all that was a meeting in 2002, which I will refer to. But just going through, and I've made some notes here, which are entirely from the documents you've shared with me, so there is nothing new that I'm contributing. In around 1999, the database we held in Oxford was going to change, and we had very good support from Rob Hollingsworth, who, of course, is the Manchester IT man, and we were going to change the software. And I was asked to come up with a draft protocol. You have this document. It's dated the 20th of December 1999, and one of the opening words is, information about an individual will only be added only if he or she consents. Looking at other excerpts from UKHCDO executive meetings, I note, for instance, on the 11th of February, we have comments from both Professor Christine Lee and Professor Charles Hay about informed consent. These are the words of Professor Hay. Consent needs to be obtained in writing, which was a major undertaking. Some patients would, of course, refuse. CL, Christine Lee, reminded Charlie Hay, quote, that they had discussed splitting the database into those giving consent and those who did not. UKHCDO Executive Committee, 5th of June 2000. Christine Lee refers to contingency plans if the patient consents are not obtained by the end of the year. Data Management Group, 8th of August 2000. In the minutes, Dr. Giangrande's view is that consent will be obligatory for research purposes in an anonymous format. The first meeting of the new advisory board under the constitution of UKHCDO was on the 11th of September 2000. I was not present. Charles Hay is quoted in the minutes as saying, from the end of this year, UKHCDO needed to take steps to get consent from their patients. This information could be collected on a prospective basis, i.e. the next time the patients attended the clinic. There was no need for doctors to write to the patients for this consent. Dr. Brown asked if there were any problems with electronic transfer of data. Dr. Hay said no. I, in a letter to Frank Hill on the 11th of July 2001, which is about the Hemophilia Society's HCV project, note, because I'm requesting release of information to the patients, I'm sure that you will recognise that the implementation of proposed changes to the database very much requires collaboration from the Haemophilia Society, and this presents an opportunity to show good intent in our collaboration. But on the Data Management Group meeting of the 7th of February 2002, there was a complete reversal of policy. It was agreed, I'm quoting from the minutes, that patients would be informed but not consented. This was largely driven by the contributions from Karen Pappenheim, the then CEO of the Haemophilia Society, And Susan Schoenfield, who was from the London consortium, that is the purchasers, and she was attending the data management meeting for the first time. So there was a reversal of policy, but I want to make clear it is my view that patient consent should be sought for the database, and I really see no problems in doing so.
And do you have any insight as to why that issue was so long debated within UK HCGO, and why it was not resolved more swiftly and straightforwardly?
I don't, and it leads me on to another issue, and that was the new constitution of the UK HCGO, which came into place in 2000. The first meeting, I told you, was on the 11th of September. Before then, we had an executive committee where a representative from each haemophilia centre attended a meeting. Under the new constitution, which is on the website, we have an executive committee, so the name remains the same, and we have 4 members. We have an elected chairman, a vice chairman, a treasurer, and a secretary. And according to the constitution, they meet 3 times a year. And then the advisory board meets up with them. But I've never seen minutes from the executive committee under the new constitution. And it's impossible for me to trace who said what to whom, and therefore answer your question properly. I don't know all the discussions that took place, but there clearly was a complete reversal of policy in early 2002.
You had, in the 90s, is this fair, 2 roles. You were director of the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, and then you were, because of the historic location of this information and the submission of annual returns to Oxford, you were, along with Ms. Spooner, the recipient of data received from haemophilia centres across the country.
Yes.
Can I ask you, first of all, in relation to your role as Haemophilia Centre Director in Oxford, was there anything that precluded you from at least obtaining written consent from your patients to the provision and retention of their data?
Well, the Oxford database was inspected, I've forgotten the precise date, by the Caldecott Guardian. And the Caldecott Guardian, of course, for those that don't know, and clearly you do, is a responsible senior person within a hospital who has responsibility for making sure that data are cared for properly on behalf of the patients. And during that time, the Caldecott Guardian, who was based in Oxford, I'm not going to mention a name, was entirely satisfied with the arrangements that were in place. And I can't really introduce in my own trust a consent form on my own.
In relation, again, still to your patients at Oxford, do you know the extent to which, prior to your arrival in 1991, patients had been told that confidential data, including data about HIV status and so on, was being collected and analysed centrally for purposes other than their own clinical care and treatment?
It was not something that was hidden from patients, and I would say the following. I recognise that not everybody, of course, is a member of the Haemophilia Society, but the Haemophilia Society was certainly aware because they were present at each UKCDO annual general meeting when the data were presented. And I personally have written and spoken, written many articles for the Haemophilia Society and spoken at events where this has been mentioned. Certainly, we encourage our patients to keep records of their treatment. And one of the messages that we've tried to get over to the patients is that it's important to do so because the data are collected for the purpose of a national database. So I believe many of them certainly were aware of it, and indeed for some patients it's been a great source of information. I would single out, for instance, women who are potential carriers have often asked us, because they want us to trace people they may be distantly related to help them determine their own carrier status for haemophilia. So my answer to your question is, no documents were produced. I believe the great majority of patients were aware of the existence of the national database, and indeed, probably in Oxford, proud that it was in our centre.
And is that based on an assumption on your part, in part because of the location of the database within Oxford in the 90s?
Inevitably, there's an assumption before I start in 1991, but what I've said equally applies to after I started.
Is this right, that there was no systematic attempt in Oxford, and I'm only asking you about the centre of which you were director, not others, no systematic attempt in Oxford to tell each patient what kind of data was being stored about them and the arrangements for their storage?
That's true.
And we've seen evidence, and I think your own statement refers to it in part, that UK HCDO, or National Haemophilia Database, was used anonymously in terms of the information that was collated and provided to provide data to third parties from time to time.
Yes, it was. So, for instance, the World Federation of Hemophilia, we produced aggregate reports for the World Federation of Hemophilia, to give one example.
Were you ever involved in collating information from the database and providing it to pharmaceutical companies?
We did basically sell the annual reports. That was agreed by UKHCDO. So they were able to pay for, and I've forgotten, it was a very modest price. So they were able to get copies of the reports just of the type you've been showing me earlier. But we never, in Oxford, did any, they never even asked us actually to carry out independent research.
And what year was it in which the National Haemophilia Database transferred from Oxford to Manchester and ceased to be your responsibility?
2002.
There's one piece of data produced by Ms. Spooner I wanted to ask you about. It's GGCL 5039, please. Shomek. Minutes of an HIV working party in January 1997. But if we could go, please, to page 7. We can see here some information gathered together by Ms. Spooner in January of 1997. It says 45 wives or partners of 43 haemophilia A patients and one partner of a haemophilia B patient are known to have become HIV positive. 10 of the wives of haemophilia A patients have developed AIDS, 8 have died. Full details of 7 of the cases have been received and accepted as AIDS cases by CDSC. More information has been requested regarding the other 3. Only wives or partners of patients identified by haemophilia centre directors have been included in the above data. Is this fair that this information here might well be an underestimate, because this is based upon information provided by haemophilia centre directors? You've already told us, I think, that some directors didn't provide information or didn't provide complete information.
Yeah, yes, I think your statement is right, but let's be clear. I suspect that this is a very accurate picture, because it was relatively few centres that didn't send us data, and the data wasn't sent to us from really 1996 onwards, and I guess this would have been an issue, the transmission sexually of HIV, earlier. So while you're right, it doesn't mean they're wildly inaccurate figures.
So it's unlikely to be an overestimate.
Yes.
It's possibly an underestimate, but you would say not a wild underestimate.
Exactly.
Do you know whether there was any more systematic analysis of the numbers of partners or family members infected with HIV?
I'm not aware of any, no.
And then, just still on the topic of data, could we have HCDO 40-254_029, please? So this was a letter from you to Dr. Hay in November of 2003, expressing concerns about the way in which Dr. Hay was using UK HCDO data for presentations. And then we can see in the second paragraph, you talk about the presentation of data coming from the national database without mentioning UK HCDO. It says the rules of the use of UK HCDO data for presentation are very clear. Prior written permission needs to be sought through channels set out in our constitution. The data you presented are certainly not in the public domain. I would hardly imagine that UK HCDO would have granted permission for you to reveal these data at this stage to one of the companies in the setting of a paid advisory meeting. And then in the last paragraph, you refer to an accusation against you in the past of plundering data from the UK HCDO database. Can I ask, first of all, whether you're able to expand upon the incident that this correspondence referred to?
I'm afraid I don't recall it, and you only shared this letter with me very recently, so I haven't had a lot of time to reflect on it. I'm afraid I really can't recall the details. I think it's very clear already in this letter what I'm talking about, and I can't add to that. I think.
Okay. And then just in the last two sentences, there's a reference to you having been accused of plundering data from the database in the past. Can you recall anything further about that?
I can, and let me say that I think one of the good things about UKHCDO is that we can collaborate and very occasionally have terse exchanges. And I think that's really one of the recipes for success. So before I answer your question, let me just comment that I think the UKHCDO is an extraordinarily successful collaboration. I've got a lot of experience of haemophilia organisations around the world through my role with World Federation of Haemophilia and EHC. And, if you go to, and I was thinking of a meeting in Germany, you'll have all the senior people mixing, and I was stunned last time I went there, they're all using the formal Z to each other, but there's no collaboration. And that's why with your expert HIV report, there is talk of the Bonn cohort. It's not the German cohort because they don't collaborate. And I think one of the recipes for success in an organization is that people can talk freely and frankly and have an exchange of opinion. If we've got a project, what have we got to do to deliver it and get it, over the line? Now, what is being talked about here is controversy that followed the publication of the HIV article in Nature and others. And without going into detail, I think it, although the project had been cleared with UKHCDO, I think there was, and I have to say, understandable. There was a little bit of understandable anxiety that data were being published. All I can say is that the project, which led to the various publications, had been discussed with UKHCDO in advance. But look, these sorts of exchanges are not uncommon in academic life. And I don't want this one letter, which is probably the only harsh letter you will find in any archives relating to letters I've written, to in any way give the impression that the UKHCDO collaboration is not a productive one. It is a very good one. And I think the fact that we can exchange harsh words occasionally is no bad thing.
And so this really was the purpose of my question, Dr. Giangrande, the reference to learning from the lessons of the past in the last line of that letter. Is that a reference to what you've just referred to?
Yes,
concerns
and I
about
think,
the publication
if you
of the
want me
data?
to build on that, I'm very happy to do that. And I think the Nature paper that you alluded to, that you presented, when we produced the paper, I thought we had done everything we could to get everybody on board. You will have seen in bold type at the top, mention was made of the authors, and in equally bold type, UK Haemophilia Centre Doctors Organisation. Unusually for a letter, we were able to print all the names of the haemophilia centres, the institutions and the doctors. And I can tell you, Nature was not happy about that. It takes up a lot of space in a journal. We did that. I have to say, personally, I didn't handle it as well as I could. I was younger and naive then, and I think I should have shown the document to UKHCDO colleagues for review beforehand, and that didn't happen. But we made sure, and we worked together, and we spoke to make sure that future projects that came out of this we could get it over the line, we'd work and we'd collaborate. And we did that in a number of ways. You'll see the subsequent publications that come out of the same analysis of the data include more diverse authors, in other words, authors from several other haemophilia centres. You'll see that we put as the author for correspondence the chairman of UKHCDO at the time, who at the time I think was Frank Hill. And in fact, in one of them, the AIDS 2004 paper, we went even further. It was anonymous. It was only when you look at the end, you see who the writing committee is. You won't find that paper if you look online. So the point is we worked together to make sure that the project would get over the line by finding out, what people wanted.
There's a further publication I want to ask you to look at on a completely different topic, Dr. Giangrande. It's HCDO 40-133_024, please. HCDO 40-133_024. So you'll see that this is a retrospective neuropathological review of prion disease in UK haemophilic patients, and you are one of several authors. Dr. Giangrande, I'm going to ask you about the issue of Vcjd notification in a few minutes. I just specifically wanted to ask you about this particular project. If we go to page 3, we can see in the first paragraph it says, in order to examine the possibility of transmission of CJD via large pool clotting factor concentrates, we've examined the brains of 33 HIV-1 positive haemophilic patients who had died from HIV/AIDS or liver disease. And then it refers to the practice of the three haemophilia centres involved, Royal Free Oxford and Edinburgh, to use British donor source plasma clotting factor concentrate whenever possible. Does it follow then that amongst the brains of those who were examined for the purposes of this study, there were Oxford patients?
Yes, I mean, you spoke to Christine Lee, I believe, about this when you examined her, when she was speaking, but that's absolutely right. She was the architect of this project, and I think it was a very important project. So it was using stored brain material from 33 people with haemophilia who had died, obviously, and who had been treated with British plasma. And the importance of the publication and why it was done follows on from the change in perception about the risk of variant CJD in 1996 and 1997. So with the discussion of the possibility that, contrary to previous reassurance, British plasma might transmit prions, the immediate question was, is there a danger here? Is there a real risk that people with haemophilia who could be developing variant CJD? And analysing this post-mortem material was one way of answering that question. And it provided a rapid and reassuring answer. Of the 33 brain samples from patients heavily treated with British donor source plasma, both from England and Scotland, no prions were identified in any of the brain sections. Now, statistically, it's not possible to say that the risk of variant CJD is 0 with just 33 samples. In each statistical calculation, there is what's called the power, the statistical power. And to get a figure of 0, I don't know off the top of my head, but you'd need many more than that. And I believe the figure, if we go down somewhere in the paper, going from memory, the risk we said was 11%. It was around 11%. But the point is, the study was a reassuring one for us. And I'm surprised, actually, that this publication didn't get more publicity than it did at the time. I think it's an important publication that provided reassurance to me, if not to the wider haemophilia community.
Was it routine to store brain tissue samples at Oxford?
Let's be clear. Firstly, by the way, as Professor Lee said when you examined her, this was before the days of the older Hay business. And let's be clear, none of these tissues were stored in the Oxford Haemophilia Centre. I had no knowledge of this. One of the authors is Professor Margaret Izeri, and she was the neuropathologist at the Radcliffe Infirmary. And she had the material, and I provided the clinical data.
And do you know whether the relatives of the patients, the deceased patients, whose tissue samples were being stored and then studied in this way, had they been informed of that or asked for consent?
I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that.
Would you expect that to have been done by you or by the neuropathologist if it was done?
I would have expected it to have been done by the person seeking consent for the post-mortem. That's the usual thing. So if somebody dies, the clinician normally seeks permission from a relative for a post-mortem to be carried out. It's not normally the pathologist's responsibility, unless we're talking about serious accidents, that sort of thing. But in normal clinical practice, it's the clinician who's been looking after the patient that would request such permission.
I want to move to ask you, but relatively shortly, because it's quite well documented, about recombinant. There was a recommendation by UK HCGO in its 1997 guidelines in support of recombinant. And as I understand it, at the point in time at which that recommendation was made, there was still no form of national funding available for recombinant.
That's right. The recommendation was actually produced and reached in 1996, but it was published right at the beginning of 1997. But actually, the recommendation was made, I think, in October or November of 1996.
And if we look at some comments you made, or you're recorded as having made in a newspaper article, Seamus, it's BPLL 001 6004 _ 007. We can see this is dated May of 1998. And if we look in the middle column, sorry, could we have the whole document, Seamus? If we look in the middle column, we can see that children under the age of 16 are going to start to receive recombinant. And then it says in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland had already started phasing in recombinant product for all patients. And then there are some comments from you in the two columns towards the right of the page, picking it up towards the bottom of the article in the bottom right-hand corner. You say, the article says, the government's new policy has improved the situation somewhat, but it's still not good enough, says Dr. Giangrande. I feel like Oliver Twist asking for more, but we won't be fully satisfied until, and then can we go over the page, please? All UK patients get recombinant factor 8. This is an unfair ageist policy, and what happens when someone turns 16, it's unworkable. And then the article refers to the risk of viral infections from American plasma. And then under the heading counselling effort, you're reported as saying, for a significant minority of my patients, American plasma is the arch enemy. What needs to be made clear is the immense amount of time and effort spent counselling patients about all these issues. First of all, was that an accurate reporting of your views.
Yeah, I think it is. And that point about patients wanting British plasma is a very important one. And I remember a case very vividly, actually, of a patient that was referred to us for surgery, orthopedic surgery. He had a septic arthritis, and he was referred to us from Devon. And he had to go to surgery in the evening, and he was writhing in pain and crying. And I went to treat him. And as I went to, inject him, he suddenly became lucid, and he looked at me. He said, "That's not American plasma, is it?" I said, "No, this is BPL. It's 8Y." And he was reassured, and then he went back to writhing on the bed. And it was a big issue for patients that I dealt with.
And then we'll just look at one more document in relation to recombinant, which is a letter published in the Journal of Thrombosis and Hemostasis from you in 2003. It's WITN 3311004, please, Shomek. And I just wanted to invite your observations on two passages. So we can see that the heading, treatment of haemophilia, recombinant factors only, yes. If we look in the paragraph on the right-hand side, top of the page, the last few lines of that paragraph, you refer to the VCJD crisis raising anxieties in the haemophilia community around the world. And then you say this, in the UK, we've had to counsel many patients who were notified in early 2001 that they'd been treated with batches of factor 8 and 9 concentrates issued in 96-97, to which a donor had subsequently died of VCJD, had contributed plasma. These patients would have been spared this ordeal if recombinant products had been widely adopted for the treatment of haemophilia as soon as they were licensed in 1994. Again, does this remain your view of the historic position?
It does. I would say for a global audience, I would have to point out that in fact in the US and Canada, actually factor 8 was licensed a recombinant factor 8 was licensed in 1992, as it happens. But, and I just really noticed that, I've quoted the UK date of 1994, but it remains my view.
And if we go to the second page, please, Shomek. Just picking it up at the bottom of the left-hand column, so we can go down the page. You say this, the reality is that it is simply the increased cost of recombinant concentrates compared to conventional plasma products, rather than rational scientific arguments, which is the principal obstacle to their wider use. In view of all the problems associated with viral infections in people with haemophilia over the last 2 decades, it is clear that there is indeed much wisdom in Aldous Huxley's aphorism that the lesson of history is that the lessons of history are never learnt. So your view expressed there, and you've repeated it in your statement, was that one of the principal reasons, here you're suggesting the principal obstacle to the use of recombinants was funding.
Yes, I mean, in 2003, that was clear. If we had this discussion in about 1994, 95, 96 even, there would be room for rational argument over, for instance, the fact that the early recombinant factor 8s contained human albumin. So is that a risk factor? Have we truly eliminated the risk? There could have been some rational discussion about the incidence of inhibitors, for instance. But by 2003, when this article was written, those discussions had been resolved. It was purely finance.
In your statement, and this is WITN 3311003, please, Shomek. If we go to page 43, I'm going to try. Yes, bottom of the page, so if we can go to the bottom, please. You say, in paragraph 95.2, in my view, there were 3 obstacles to the immediate introduction of recombinant factor 8, which became available earlier than recombinant factor 9 in the UK. The first you refer to as lack of consensus among the medical community, to which I think you've just alluded.
Yes, and I think that was fair. That is not a criticism of medical colleagues. I think it was perfectly reasonable to spend a year or two debating this, and UKHCDO, I think, did well putting together an internal committee of some of the older and then younger members to come up with consensus. So that's not a criticism, it's a fact.
And then if we go to the top of the next page, please. The second paragraph, the second reason you give is cost. Self-evident, I don't need to ask you to comment further on that. The third point you make is this. You say, it's my opinion, but I've no evidence to support this contention, that concerns about the future and viability of BPL's fractionation facility may have delayed the authorisation of the use of commercially sourced recombinant factor VIII by the Department of Health. I understand you say there's no evidence for it. What's the basis for that, for your opinion, however?
Well, it was discussed not only in the UK. In fact, the question was asked rhetorically by Professor Jeff Savage in one of the minutes. He said, what will happen to BPL after this? In my experience globally as well, working with the World Federation of Hemophilia, this is a problem that's been faced by many fractionators in other countries, because there's often been, if we take European countries, a national fractionator. Sometimes that's a state-owned one, sometimes it's actually a commercial one working effectively as a national fractionator. So Grifols in Spain, LFB in France, and Italy has a similar arrangement. And the point is this, that if you take factor VIII out of the equation, suddenly the economics of fractionation tumbles down, because the principle is worked on taking plasma, making albumin, immunoglobulin, vaccines, and factor VIII. If the factor VIII is not going to be bought locally, then what do you do? Now, in the end, this was solved by BPL starting to sell products abroad. And I think that helped maintain them for a while. And it's interesting, when you look at the costings, again, you've shared several documents with me on this, including something I did for the Hemophilia Society. It's interesting that when you look at the costings, for instance, Lord Hunt does one, he's basing it purely on the volume of factor VIII or factor IX that needs to be bought, plus the price of recombinant factor VIII. But I was interested to see in the equation there is no mention of the impact on the fractionation facility, but clearly there is an impact, and it remains my view, and I don't think I'm alone in thinking this, that the impact of us not buying factor VIII from a British fractionator compromises the financial viability of fractionation.
Now, I want to ask you next about the VCJD notification process, and I'm going to do so by reference to an article that you've exhibited to your statement. Seamus, it's WITN 3311009, please. This is a 2010 article, Risk Reduction Strategies for VCJD Transmission by UK Plasma Products and Their Impact on Patients with Inherited Bleeding Disorders. If we could go, please, Seamus, to page 3, bottom of the page. We can see, if we go to the bottom, please, under the heading Management of Early Plasma Product Recalls, picking it up 5 lines from the bottom, the 1997 product recall letters from BPL to haemophilia centres cited the following advice that had been provided by the Ethics Committee local to the NCJ-DSU. The recipients, patients, should not be informed that the product that they, if we go over the page to the top of the next page, had received has been recalled for this reason, subsequent diagnosis of VCJD in donor. In response to queries raised by clinicians and hospital trusts about this directive, the DH confirmed to medical directors that patients who'd received implicated blood products should not be informed. This was based on 3 considerations. First, that it was not known, the word used was unlikely, whether VCJD was transmissible by blood products. Secondly, that there was no diagnostic test in existence. And finally, that no preventative treatment was available. The consensus given by the DH at the time was that patients would not benefit from this knowledge, and that uncertainty created by informing patients could cause unjustified worry and create a permanent blight on their lives. And then it says this: however, many haemophilia physicians either directly informed patients who'd received an implicated batch or provided all their patients with information about VCJD, giving them the option to be informed whether or not they'd received an implicated batch. And then the article goes on to discuss the establishment in 2000 of the CJD Incidents Panel, which then provided advice for the subsequent notifications. Now, am I right in understanding, Dr. Giangrande, that you were one of the clinicians who decided that you would notify patients in 1997?
Yes, but I want to make it clear I wasn't alone, and
No.
I'm pleased to say the great majority of clinicians did. In fact, I believe Christopher Ludlam, writing on behalf of UKCDO, wrote a letter, I think it was to the Lancet, setting this out. Now, the purpose of the recall, of course, was to let us in haemophilia centres know about this and to take back any material from those implicated batches and send them back. I don't believe the 97 recall affected any Oxford patients. The 2001 recall did. It affected 85 of our patients in 2001. But clearly, most of us felt that this was not a tenable option. And it wasn't a tenable option for a number of reasons. Firstly, there is something about, we can do something about this. We have to learn, again, from the lessons of history. And the option we have, if we're being told, I mean, why are you telling us this, I would say to BPL? If you're suggesting there's a risk to the patient, then we have to do something about it. And that something is to offer patients the chance to switch to a plasma product made from material which doesn't carry a risk of variant CJD. So a drastic change in policy for us in Oxford, but to switch from BPL, British volunteer donor plasma, to American source plasma. And that's what we did. And I'm pleased to say many other colleagues in the UK did that as well. The other issue, of course, is that I know from my work with the WFH that you can't hide this from patients. And I think it's important to be upfront and truthful with the patients, because the Haemophilia Society would definitely have come to have heard about this. And I think it simply was not tenable not to tell patients. And there was something we could do to minimise future risk.
We have a sample letter sent by you and Dr. Keeling in December of 1997 to your patients, and it refers to, as well as notifying the patient and providing information, to a meeting you'd arranged in a lecture theatre at the John Radcliffe Hospital on the 15th of December 1997 to present the evidence and discuss the matter, and to which the patient was invited. What was the purpose of that meeting? Did it take place?
It did take place, and I should explain that the John Radcliffe Hospital is our sister hospital, and it's a couple of miles away. I anticipated a very large audience, which is why I booked one of the major lecture theatres at the John Radcliffe. Now, admittedly, this was shortly before Christmas, but actually only a handful of patients turned up. I think, to be honest, by this stage, the patients, and I used the word in another article, were quite sanguine about variant CJD. And I think the risk to the patients, it was something we shared with the patient community. I've been eating beef, my family's been eating beef, we're all at risk of variant CJD. And the problem had arisen back in 1984. I think people had been reassured by the fact that no person with haemophilia had developed variant CJD. So all I can say is that I was surprised that so few people turned up, but it didn't create a stir. Having said that, quite a lot of our patients did take up the offer to switch to American plasma. We used alphanate.
And then, as you've already alluded to, you wrote to patients again in 2001. And then I think thereafter, the patient notification exercise was the one we explored with Professor Hay, which was organised, as it were, centrally through the Health Protections Agency and UKHCDO. There's an observation in a document you authored I wanted to ask you to comment on. It's DHSC.
Can I have,
Yes.
Are you going to mention the international dimension of the 2004 recall? Because I think that's important to emphasise.
You can do that now if you wish, Doctor, before we look at the documents I'm going to refer to.
Remember that the 2004 notification exercise took place in September 2004. We were told on the 9th of September about this, and we had to send letters to patients by the 20th of September. Now, actually, the point is that although this notification affected us in the UK, BPL, who was we were expected to tell people who'd received British plasma products in the period 1980 to 2001 that they were at risk of developing variant CJD. Was anyone abroad told this? No, they weren't. And this meeting, actually, this notification happened to take place just before the World Federation of Hemophilia Congress in Bangkok. And I have to say, we set up this generated a lot of anxiety and indeed anger in the international community, because BPL had exported British products to over 30 countries around the world. And in this article, the one that you've got on the screen at the moment, somewhere further down, there are 13 countries listed that had received implicated batches. But in fact, I think it was 36 actually countries had been receiving these products. And BPL, or the British government, did not make any attempt to contact individual physicians abroad in other countries. Inevitably, of course, patients in other countries learned about this, and we set up a symposium which was packed in October 2004 at the WFH Congress at the beginning of October. And we were lucky to get as speakers Bruce Evert of CDC fame, who'd taken a leading role in the HIV drama of the 80s. James Ironside also spoke. I gave a summary of the UK position. And I'm pleased to say that WFH took a lead. They circulated copies of the implicated batch numbers to the affected countries, put the details on the website, and the president of WFH joined me in a meeting with BPL immediately after that October meeting in Bangkok. And in the end, what BPL did was, or the British government, they sent notices to the health ministers of the various countries, inviting them to seek information from the local British embassy, but no contact was made with any physicians.
And then the documents I'm going to ask you to look at, which is about the impact on patients, is at DHSC 306838_071. We can see it's the UK experience, treater and patient association perspectives, and these are presentations given by you and by Karen Pappenheim. If we go to the next page, we can see the heading Communicating Risk, the example of VCJD, the UK experience, the treater perspective. And then if we can go to the next page, please. Could we zoom in on the third paragraph beginning, or under the heading, what was the reaction of our patients, please, Shomik? So this was your observation. As a general rule, the reaction was surprisingly phlegmatic. Many recognised that in contrast to previous outbreaks of HIV and hepatitis, VCJD is an issue which faces all of us who live in the UK, and not just the recipients of blood products, which is, I think, the effect of your evidence a few moments ago. But then you say this, however, there were several notable exceptions where real and persisting anxiety has been generated, including several patients who have consulted me because they are convinced that they are harbouring VCJD.
That's true, yes. This, by the way, for those that aren't aware, was a World Federation of Hemophilia meeting in Montreal.
And then if we could go a little further down the page, Shomik, to the paragraph under the heading, were there any other consequences? And you said this one unexpected consequence was that some patients who'd received these batches were regarded as being at high risk of transmitting infection themselves. There were several instances of patients being denied surgery, dental work or endoscopy because of the implications for surgical instruments. Advice was sought from the Department of Health, and although guidelines are expected to be published, these have not yet been forthcoming at the time of writing. To what extent was that problem of patients being denied surgery, or we've heard cases of patients' surgery being deferred, and the issue over accessing dental care and endoscopies. To what extent was that a problem in Oxford, and how, if at all, was it resolved?
Yes, it became a much bigger problem, of course, after the 2004 notification, because we've got to remember that here we're talking about the 2001 notification. But if I could squeeze them both together, I would say the biggest impact was undoubtedly dental work. We were lucky in Oxford because we had a good dental service that operated initially in the Nuffield Orthopaedic Centre, and then for a number of years we had a dental service actually within the Oxford Haemophilia Centre, and then because of budgetary cuts it was moved to the East Oxford Health Centre, but still patients could be seen. But a lot of patients did have problems outside the immediate Oxford area, and certainly in relation to the 2004 notification it was a serious issue. And indeed, I wrote a letter to the British Dental Journal, which you'll find in my list of publications, together with Andrew Brewer, who was a dental surgeon in Glasgow. Because the British Dental Journal obviously goes to all dentists, we wanted to make some reassuring noises, if you like, to the dental community. So I think for my patients in Oxford, the biggest single impact was the dental work. Endoscopy wasn't an issue for the patients, it was for us, because, of course, of this issue which others have talked about of quarantining endoscopes, one endoscope per person, which had cost implications, but the patients still got their endoscopy.
Then I want to then move to the topic of compensation in relation to HCV and the Haemophilia Society's campaign. Could we have, please, on screen SKIP 5031_082. We can see this is a document, report of the Hepatitis C Working Party to the Haemophilia Society, June 2002. And if we go to page 4, please, Shomek. We can see there in paragraph 1 identified the membership of the Working Party, which included yourself, Professor Preston, Dr. Macris, and Karen Pappenheim from the Haemophilia Society, as well as others. Dr. Giangrande, I'm not going to ask you about the detail of the recommendations because we have the report, but could you just outline briefly how this Working Party came about and what the purpose of reporting was?
The party was convened by the Haemophilia Society, so I don't know the background to that. We were just invited and naturally all agreed. The background was to try and get financial assistance for people who'd been affected by hepatitis C. Note, not just the patients, but also various families. It was partly as a consequence of the famous agreement whereby people signed away rights for compensation in relation to the payment made for HIV. And the purpose of this, which took, it was convened in, I think, September of 2001, we reported in June of 2002, was basically to come up with a simple costed measure. And we did this looking at systems that operated in other countries and seized upon the Canadian model, which seemed a particularly good one. We also sent out questionnaires on behalf of the Haemophilia Society to our patients in Oxford. We sent out 150 from Oxford, and also our colleagues in Sheffield sent out a similar questionnaire. How had hepatitis C affected them in their lives, in terms of their working lives? Could they get mortgages, life insurance, that sort of thing? Had it affected their income? And then we came up with a 5-stage plan which offered compensation or assistance, shall we say, according to the level of patients being affected. And I think the Skipton Fund in the end came up with, and by the way, after this report launched, we had a meeting in the House of Commons with Hazel Blear, the then Health Secretary, and there was another MP there, and this led to various discussions, which in the end led to the Skipton Fund being set up with a simpler model, a 2-stage system, but the money was pretty similar. The costing worked out at, going from memory, £52.6 million for 5 successive years. This model proposed one thing which has still not been achieved, and that is coming back to something I was saying in the morning session. Level 1 offered a compensation or assistance of £7,500 to people who'd been exposed to HCV but didn't have persistent infection, that is, they'd cleared it spontaneously. And the reason for that was we felt that being told you'd had hepatitis C, because in the early days, without the PCR tests, we couldn't say, look, you've cleared it spontaneously. We thought that generated a lot of anxiety and worry, which deserved to be rewarded. The second thing I would want to pick up on from this report is that we clearly said that this money should also be available to the relatives of the deceased. And I'm sorry to say that in the initial incarnation of the Skipton Fund, that did not happen, although I'm pleased to say that some years later, an adjustment was duly made. But that's the sort of background, and I thought it was a good report. I think it had some influence.
There's a follow-up letter you wrote to the Department of Health in October 2003, so a year or more later, which we'll just look at. DHSC 304421_005. DHSC 0004421_005. You don't have it? DHSC 0004421_005. So we can see this is a letter written by you to a Dr. Hugh Nicholas at the Department of Health, 24th of October 2003. You refer, if we can scroll down a little, please, Shamik. You refer in the to a meeting to discuss the way forward that you had been unable to attend, but Professor Passy had attended on behalf of the Society. You expressed surprise that no apparent consideration had been given to a document submitted by the Haemophilia Society. Is that the document we were just looking at, the report?
Yes.
Yeah. And then you identify what appear to be some clear differences of opinion between our own group and that which met on October the 14th. And we'll just look at the 3 points that you were there making. The first is payment to patients who'd simply tested positive for HCV antibody, even if they subsequently cleared this. And you say it may be difficult for you to appreciate the tremendous anxiety that was generated in the early 1990s when patients were tested and informed of their results for hepatitis C. People with haemophilia were among the first cohorts to be investigated and tested systematically, and this group of patients was particularly mindful of problems related to AIDS only a few years beforehand. And then if we go over the page, please. You say, we think it grossly unfair that patients co-infected with HCV and HIV should not receive additional compensation. You go on to talk about that. And then 3, equally, we feel it grossly unfair that compensation should not be offered to the relatives of those who died from hepatitis. And then you offer to discuss the points with the person to whom you're addressing it. Can you recall whether you had any further discussions with the Department of Health on these points?
I'm afraid I don't. I no longer have access to it. No, I'm afraid I don't.
But is it fair to say your letter was prompted by your understanding that there was resistance by the Department of Health to these 3 matters?
That's absolutely true.
So I note the time. I've got a few more questions for Dr. Giangrande, not too many more, but we obviously need to afford the opportunity to recognise legal representatives in the break to suggest any further lines of question. So could we take a break for 45 minutes?
Yes, so 4 o'clock in that case. So 4 o'clock, Doctor, if you wouldn't mind, and 4 o'clock to everyone.